Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm sorry for the delay, but uh, I'm still in the surur of Gulzar Saab's words. So, um, well, I had thought of saying other things to start this off with, but for those of you who were in that session, uh, Gulzar Saab was talking about the relevance of his poetry, but also poetry at large. And let me then just get down to it. Mir Taqi Mir and not Taqi. Mir Taqi Mir uh, in 2024. Why? How?
Let's deal with the why first. Kausar, in the first place, thank you so much. Looking forward very much to our conversation. And it is marvelous that we are continuing a conversation that Gulzar Saab and Pavan began earlier this afternoon. The relevance of Mir Taqi Mir today is that he lived in times that are terrifyingly like ours. Remember that last year was his 300th birthday, and this book was meant to be timed with that, but, as was said earlier, there's a certain timelessness to this project, and this work of Mir's. But Mir lived in the 18th century at a time of incredible meltdown. The British Empire was incipient, the Mughal Empire was collapsing, the East India Company was making its presence felt, and he was turned into a refugee in his own land. I mean, he was born in Agra, but he made his life in Delhi. But during the Abdali invasions, he had to move first to the Jat strongholds in Deeg and Kumher. He came back, then he ended his days in Lucknow, and he wasn't happy with that. So we're looking here at the poetry of a displaced person, and we are living in a tumultuous age where so very many people are displaced, they're forced into migration. Some of us have chosen to live elsewhere, millions have not. So it's that anguish also of the homeless that he speaks of. And to me, it was crucial because he's usually glossed as, first of all, Khuda is Khan, right, the god of poetry. There's no more to be said. And then the idea that he's a poet of love, which indeed he is, but that's not all. I was far more interested in this more political Mir.
So guess that makes the title of your book quite apparent, The Homelands and Ocean, which comes from one of the verses. Since my introduction mentioned my English literature background, I remember our very wonderful and formidable teacher, Miss Eunice D'Souza, telling us never to bring the psychoanalytic aspect into your reading of pieces, but I'm going to. Sorry. So yes. So I feel there is some kind of a personal connect with choosing to work with Mir more for his poetry, like you said, of the political nature rather than his poet of grief, poet of love, and choosing this particular verse to make your title. Now, I've given you the pieces of the puzzle. I'd like you to kind of put it together for the audience.
Oh my goodness. Could I maybe read that verse?
Sure,
And
let's start there. Yeah.
assuming I can find it in the book. Yes, I've got it. Bravo. Oopsie. But to do this in the proper way, अगर इजाजत हो.
Irshad, Irshad.
एक जगह पर जैसे भंवर है, एक जगह पर जैसे भंवर है, लेकिन चक्कर रहता है, यानी वतन दरिया है, उसमें चार तरफ हैं सफर में अब. Like the whirlpool, still center of a giddy circling, the homeland's an ocean that scatters us in all directions. And I think what you're alluding to, which also picks up on a very brief conversation we had
Yes, it does.
somewhere in Palo Alto
Yes,
a
yes.
couple of years ago, it has to do with my own, if you will, ethnic sense of not really being at home anywhere, which has to do with my diasporic background, which connects me to Kashmir through centuries of exile, What does it mean to reclaim language and its literature? What does it mean to also craft a new life elsewhere? These are questions and themes that I've had in my own poetry, and it's what I often respond to in the poetry I read. So it's true, when we reach out to the poems of others, I think we're also looking for that point of affinity. So for me, Mir, both biographically and in the way it comes across in his poems, those were the motifs that were most important to me. This leitmotif in his poetry that keeps coming back, ghurbat, it's constant. What does that word mean? Like so many Urdu words, it's polysemous. It can mean exile, it can mean misery, it can mean just feeling very blue, it can mean the world's ill fortunes have fallen on your head. But to me, the meaning of exile was very, very prominent. So this binary between Vatan and Ghurbat, finding a place where you can belong and being in an exilic condition, that binary is very, very strong for me in his poetry.
This word itself is so, evocative, kurbat, which is often confused with ghurbat, which means poverty. But in a strange way, kind of, when you're away from your homeland, you are, a pauper. So the kurbat also appears in the Iqbal, which the irony is ke kurbat mein ho agar hum rehta hai dil watan mein. And then watan ke do tukde ho gaye, but I suppose that's another poet for another day. Language, I suppose the language of Mir, as I was reading your excellent introduction. I mean, just the introduction of this book is kind of worth the ticket, So it's two books that you get in one. One is the translation of his intakhab, which means selection. So what Ranjit has done is he has laid down a beautiful framework of the 17th, 18th century Delhi, the politics, the strife, the struggle, the Afghans, the Iranians, the Rohingyas, and that whole kind of struggle that Delhi was engulfed in, and then put this poet in the center of that. It's kind of like a personal and a struggle that is going on. So, and therefore, one of the chapters, I'd say, of your introduction says the insider and the outsider, which is a literal thing because, he's kind of being displaced all the time from Delhi and to Lucknow and the Deccan and all of that, but also the themes that. So I suppose that whole idea of the insider and outsider, which again circles back to the relevance of today, that in some ways we all are, even if we are not displaced from our homelands, we are kind of displaced from our ideologies in some way or the other. So a little bit about that.
To me, one of the key tropes, and thank you for that very generous reading of the book, one of the key tropes for thinking about poetry in that period for me is patronage. And it occurred to me from the empirical record that through his life, there was this tension in Mir. You see it a generation later in Ghalib as well. There's, on the one hand, a sense of with each poet, there was a sense that just as poets, they were exalted sensibilities. Each poet also drew on a particular ancestral narrative that gave them a particular pride. Mir harped on his being a Sayyid, being a Hijazi, that his ancestors had come from the heartland of Arabia, that he was descended from the Prophet. Ghalib was very proud of his Turco-Persian origins. Mirza is Amirzai, of the family of Timur. But alongside that was an incredible, as we would now say, precarity. Both of these poets were incredibly dependent on sometimes whimsical patrons. So it was interesting in Mir's case for me to think about how across his lifetime he had 5 very intriguing patrons. One of them, a 17-year-old Grand Vizier of the Mughal Empire, a kingmaker, one of the most brutal characters in that dramatis personae, but other kinder souls. Interestingly, all of them, no matter what they did in their political lives, they all loved poetry, and they supported poets as thinly veiled, by the way, pointer for the present moment. They all supported poets, but that support was not necessarily guaranteed. So it's this intriguing mix here that I find in a poet like Mir, where he's part of this political formation. Some of his writing is geared to that, and then there's the inner life of poetry.
Yes, and what struck me, since you mentioned Ghalib, and I'm going to come to the Mir and Ghalib comparison, but there's this famous share of Ghalib which says, "Ghalib wazifa khwar ho, do shah ko dua, वो दिन गए कि कहते थे नौकर नहीं हूँ मैं." So the patronage aspect comes in, but I think while someone like Ghalib, the little that I know, sought active patronage and was a court poet, I think there was perhaps more pride or more a sense of his own importance, that of course he did find patronage, like you said, 5 different, but I suppose it was more subtle than it was perhaps Ghalib's way.
Ghalib was very obvious
Yeah.
in his seeking of patronage, but I think he was probably more precarious. But in Mir's case also, there's very much there's a lot of scrambling for patronage, and then from the record, you don't always realize. I had to actually work on the timelines. He spent a lot of time away from Delhi, outside his, as one might say, comfort zone, in these Jat strongholds. Then again, there's a whole new Nawabate in Lucknow, which he's coming to terms with. There was a sense of tension with the patron. This is very clear, particularly in the later Lucknow phase, where he and his patron, the patron was a fairly relaxed kind of soul who thought poetry was one among other diversions. Mir took that personally. But I think it also speaks to a certain certain liberties that poets could take in those days, and patrons understood that these were special figures who needed to be given their own time and place. Yeah, but I think it's also probably a function of the fact that we don't have as much correspondence. Ghalib's correspondence is voluminous. It's all available. It's in print.
So the publishing aspect. So there's this whole discussion in the book where Ranjit talks about how, of course, Ghalib is Ghalib, but because all his work was printed, documented, it kind of is easier to court him now as the Sukhan e shair to abhi bhi Mir ko hi kaha jata hai, but perhaps in the populist way, Ghalib is more read and quoted than Mir is, which is very interesting because the language of Mir is closer to what we call Hindustani today. So in Mir's time, it wasn't even called Urdu yet. So you have that Urdu and Rekhta and what you call the Hindavi continuum, which I'm very interested in, because I think we should call what we speak Hindustani in any case, because कोई खालिस उर्दू नहीं बोलता, बोल सकता भी नहीं, और ना, at least in India, and neither do ना तो हम शुद्ध हिंदी में बात कर रहे हैं. But anyway, a little bit about that very interesting idea of the Hindavi continuum with the Braj Bhasha and the Avdi and the Khari Boli, which was Mir's language.
Absolutely. I think it points us towards the fact that the name Urdu that we give to this language doesn't really cover the complexity of its historical development. And at the time that Mir was writing, and we're thinking here of the 18th century, it was really, for part of his lifetime, the name Urdu was applied to Persian. It is Zuban-e-Urdu e Muala e Shah Jahanabad. So the language of the entourage of the capital city. So only later, actually in the 1780s is when the term Urdu is first used. And he only ever calls it Hindi, sometimes Rekhta. And it's also a phase in the language when it's very close to Khari Boli, to Avadi, to Braj. And you find those turns of phrase, grammatical forms that have fallen out, which you find in the way he writes. And by the time you get to Ghalib, also because Ghalib really thought he was a Persian poet who was doing Urdu readers a favor, he has a vast Persian Farsi divan as well. But it's curious, like you said, that we all prize, many of us have archives of memory of Ghalib, and his is a more difficult poetry. It's more Persianate, it's full of complex izafats. That is not usually the case with Mir, and yet Mir is a little distant from us. But that is that, if you will, in the best sense, the hybridity of Mir's language points us to the fact that he was one of these figures, like his step uncle Khani Arzu. There are many very interesting people in this period.
This one is one of the most interesting.
Yeah, because Khani Arzu was a philologist. We tend to think that philology is a discipline that arrives from out west. This was someone who was comparing Farsi and Sanskrit. He was developing a sense of what Persian words were present in Indic usage and the other way around, a complex scholar. And people like these were forming their linguistic experience between Persian and what I've called the Hindavi continuum, which is these 18 or 19 languages that are spoken from the Himalayan foothills to Telangana and from Rajasthan to Bihar. And they all, unfortunately, today get bundled in as dialects. Terrible word, never use the word dialect. Dialects of Hindi. The official standard Hindi that many of us have studied at school is about 100 years old. It came out of the pages of a journal called Saraswati. And it's a modern language. Whilst these languages have robust literatures in song, performance, prayer, reflection, Bhojpuri, Magahi, Maithili, Bundeli, Awadhi, Braj Bhasha, all of these. So to me, the excitement as one poet reading another, to read Mir, is to really see how he's using all these resources.
Do you want to give us an example? Yeah. The difficulty, I'm sorry, but there is one difficulty with this book.
Say on.
The pages are numbered in the Roman numbering, which for my note making was like, oh, X and the 3 I's after that.
There was actually an internal discussion.
Yeah.
But this is the publishing tradition, that the introduction, the preliminaries are all in Roman, but LXX111. शायर हो मत चुप के रहो, अब चुप में जाने जाती हैं, बात करो अब्यात पढ़ो, कुछ बैतें हमको बताते रहो. You're a poet. Don't be silent. Lives are lost under cover of silence. Speak up. Read a couple of lines. Read us verses. Keep talking to us. Now, there are some things that are... what can't be translated here. Usually I'm a great one for saying, what's this nonsense about lost in translation? Let's look at the gains. Some things are lost. In the second line, there are 2 plurals for bet, which is home or house in Arabic. Abyat and bete. So abyat is the high Perso-Arabic plural. Bet, abyat. But bete comes from the Demotic. So I just want to flag that here to talk about how even in a single line, he's using references to and the richness of 2 different linguistic traditions.
So I think this is a great point to talk about your reading and your work on Mir's poetry, is where you have chosen a language that is modern, that is accessible, and yet, of course, something will be lost, but a lot is gained. But I was kind of a little surprised by the use of, say, words like posh, or words like shambolic, or it's many more, but the X and Y's will now get in my way. But my question really is that that must have been an important choice. And how did you come to that?
Mir says here somewhere, "Ittefaqat hain zamane ke," which I rather rudely translate as "stuff happens."
Now you're being polite when you say stuff. Yes.
Indeed. But to speak to your example, and I'll talk a little about my... They always say, talk about your process. Thank you for not saying that. क्या जानू लोग कहते हैं किसको सुरूर कल्ब, आया नहीं ये लफ्ज़ तो हिंदी ज़ुबान के बीच. How would I know what folks call the heart's pleasance? That posh word hasn't made its way into Hindi yet.
Even the choice of the word pleasance. So both these words, pleasance and posh.
Pleasance is, as you well know, straight out of Chaucer land. But I have, I think there's sometimes good reason to pick out these archaisms and give them new life, especially if it's ironic, as this is. Because I wanted a word that really seemed weirdly high register. And posh, because there was no way to convey the tonality of what he's saying. His readers immediately, his listeners actually, because he was pre-print. So his listeners knew what he meant when he said, "Aya nahi ye lafz to Hindi zuban ke beech." Remember also he's calling his language Hindi. So I had to add posh to just point up the language politics there.
Yeah, but such an excellent choice. I mean, one would say, one would think it's such a common everyday word, and yet it fits in so beautifully. So thank you. Yeah. Just to kind of go back, a minute, when you were talking about all the how we shouldn't use the word dialects because they're all legit and very old and important languages in themselves. So, and Urdu, as we know it today, is a very modern Indian language. तो हिंदी हिंदू कब से हो गई और उर्दू मुसलमान कैसे हो गई?
The tendency is always to blame it on the Brits. But in this case, I think we could legitimately, if there is anybody from the United Kingdom here, try not to take it personally. A lot of this has to do with the meltdown after 1857. But in multiple ways. It wasn't just the British as some abstraction. I think there was first the sense that an empire of long standing had collapsed and that its cultural and political assumptions were no longer relevant. That was, I think, a crucial problem. And then there was a certain sense of a new politics of identity, which, especially in northern India, as you know, went in two different directions. And it was centered on language. I think there was a need to take this Hindavi continuum and to refigure it for two different kinds of political agendas. I'm crudely summarizing about 70 or 75 years. But you see the results of it by the 1920s. There's, on one side, there is a need to fight with the demons of the Ritikal, the beautiful bhakti and shringar-oriented poetry of Braj Bhasha and Avadhi. And I'm just going to say provisionally the Hindu side now. The feeling was this was all extremely effeminate, that trope was used, and that the language had to be reformatted on a more masculine, Khadi Boli base with a Sanskrit superstructure. On the provisionally Muslim side, there was a kind of equivalent sense that one had to now belong to a larger ummah, be part of a more global discussion, and to assert the more Perso-Arabic elements of the language, out of which you eventually come to this so-called Hindi and the so-called Urdu of today.
We did have a happy and encouraging moment when the progressive writers movement happened in India, in Hindi and Urdu, but ab hum 100 saal piche ja chuke hain, to khair. But we get good books from there. So another thing that really struck me about the way you have selected, I mean, there is reams and reams of stuff to go through as far as Mir is concerned, and in kind of different kinds of literary tradition. How did you come upon this intikhab, which means selection?
One step further yet from the intikhab would be, I treated this really as my listeners or readers' bayaz. It was just very much a sense that the bayaz is a notebook, many of you will know this, a notebook that people who went to mehfils and mushairas would keep, where they would write down their favorite ashar, shairs, plural of shair. And quite often the way in which the ghazal existed in people's literary imagination was really through these ashar that they were putting down for themselves. I find it amazing in candlelit circumstances, people quickly pulling this thing out and making a quick calligraphic note. So that's the tradition that seemed very real to me. For all kinds of reasons, this is not a hard and fast rule, but it seemed to me that for this particular book, what I wanted to do was to preserve that sense of of the primal poem. It's the sher that's the poem in the Urdu tradition. The ghazal is all very well, it's a concatenation of ashar, but those two lines with their high compression, that's really the heart of the poem. So I just wanted to be, in some sense, true to that Bayaz tradition, for one. And it also seemed to just produce a kind of incredible illumination whilst one is doing ghazals. Uh, we know this, there are fine practitioners of this art here, Shumantro, I see you, uh, where it's possible to carry through the cadence and the energy of the ghazal, even though the verses might not be connected. In this case, I just wanted to see what the individual ashar, the individual shares could do.
I, I possibly shouldn't, but I will. Uh, Speaking of ghazals, why haven't the Hindi movies found Mir? They got Ghalib and we, and kind of we are doing well there. But why has Mir escaped? I mean, there is your patta patta buta
Exactly,
buta,
yeah.
but yeah.
And I was gently corrected by
Yes.
Nirupama Kotru, our friend and colleague, who said, "They haven't forgotten him completely. You will find Mir." But not to the extent of Ghalib. And that's a conundrum I try to look at in the introduction. Ghalib is just far more present. He seems historically present to us. And it also had to do with the fact that he presided over 5 printed editions of his kulliyat, his collected works. And the way in which that's rippled out into the popular media, into public culture, it's been on a completely different scale. So I don't know, I think there's something about Mir that remains perplexing. Although the critical tradition has been to say, sadgi, ravangi, it's that it's all this sort of uh, the flowingness of it, the simplicity of it. But there's something in Mir that is highly contrarian. He's whimsical, he's humorous, he's pensive. I don't think those moods always lend themselves to a simple interpretation.
We spoke of his language and your use of vocabulary to kind of translate and recreate, I'd say, some of his works. But I want to just come back a little bit to the simplicity of Mir, and now the difficulty not of vocabulary but of style, because again, that question sometimes perplexes me, that when when you're translating something, especially a poem, to be enjoyed as a poem, right, so you want to be as close to that emotional feeling while reading it, apart from the rhyme, the meter, the scale, and all of that. And I'll use a very, very commonly known a share of Mir, which is सिरहाने मीर के आहिस्ता बोलो और कोई ना बोलो. There are two versions. So सिरहाने मीर के आहिस्ता बोलो टुक रोते रोते अभी सो गया है. Now the tuk, एक तो I find this word fascinating. The tuk, and I'll let you talk about that. अब अगर टुक जो लफ्ज़ है उसको हम पहली लाइन में डालते हैं, सिरहाने मीर के आहिस्ता बोलो टुक, speak softly, or very little, or don't, however you want to use the word took. But if you put it in the next line, it is सिरहाने मीर के आहिस्ता बोलो टुक रोते रोते अभी सो गया है. तो मुझे आहिस्ता बोलना है, कम बोलना है, या वो कम रोते रोते सोया है या कम सोया है. Now, this is something that is, and especially when there isn't much of, a discussion on that, on the usage of language of that poet. How did you come upon those difficulties? And tell us about what you think of, how would you translate to?
It's actually some of those, what are they? Parts of speech, prepositions, conjunctions, which I found very intriguing. Like, could that mean, or the sa, like,
Sa.
yeah, it's, and they've all gone out of the language. So it's, in some cases, would that be therefore? In some cases, would it be just a little? Would it be more like? So it's really these, I'm going to try and look for one of these.
While you look, a few days ago, I was sitting and, sorry, I'll use the dreaded word, watching the process of a dear friend and a author and a film historian written books and subtitled over almost 1,000 films, Nasreen Munni Kabir. And we were talking about the subtitle work. And there, brevity is important because you like she was telling me, you want to see the film, not read the film. But when it comes to translating a poem, you want to feel it, and you want the full effect of the root language, of the parent language. So I remember, and then I had to do this days later. So these 2 days I've been thinking about how would one really decide. Okay, but
But for me, they were the words like took or saw, or another one that I can't immediately remember, ketang, keten. Some of these terms actually make for what I think of as the diaphanity of Urdu syntax. Did you find one?
yeah, I'm looking.
Okay.
I'm listening also.
Okay.
Okay, but I
And
found something else. But
oh, okay. The- And I actually, over the years that I've spent working on Mir, I found that my own poetry in English was uh, gaining something. So for me, this has been actually a long apprenticeship, and I always see translation as apprenticeship, to see how these little twists in a sentence uh, can allow you to read that poem in two completely different ways. For instance, yeah. So
well, no. So this is something else. The Ajab Hote Hain Shair, that one. So I had marked that again to talk about the use of Ghalib's use of the word bedhadke. Now, bedhadke, I mean, you'll see it in a Yashraj film. You'll hear it, bedhadke, and he's writing this in the 17th or 18th century. And then you have used the phrase, I just love that lot. And I'm like, I yes, I don't even use it to text my daughter. I just love that lot. She'll be, don't try to be cool, mom. So so let's talk a bit about this. It's poem 129. Yeah, it's a beautiful share and translation.
also, we don't really know the chronology of the poetry because the kulliyat was not, no kulliyat is really arranged chronologically, as you know. So it's just from internal evidence that you can sometimes sense, oh, when he's complaining that Lucknow is shambolic,
So you know
you know
where he
where he is.
was.
Exactly. Yeah. But this one could have been anywhere. अजब होते हैं शायर भी मैं इस फिरके का आशिक हूँ अजब होते हैं शायर भी मैं इस फिरके का आशिक हूँ कि बेधड़के भरी मजलिस में ये असरार कहते हैं. That B here is like your tuk.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm also one of these guys. Or poets, they're amazing. I just love that lot. Unfazed, they'll broadcast secrets to an assembly.
Now, again, I was surprised by the word broadcast rather than, I don't know, reveal. And yes,
Yeah, because something about asrar is it takes us to that whole body of wisdom literature, the Sufi tradition. It was very, very important to Dara Shikoh, who's like a phantom in these pages also, for other reasons that become clear. But what is that great secret? There's a reference there to a kind of spiritual path. But here I wanted to make that contrast of someone who is just going to just put that secret out at large. And also pointing to what this sher is saying about the role of poetry in some ways. We began by talking about relevance. It's also about how the poet can be a bridge figure
right.
from expert culture, from the interiority of a spiritual tradition, from the court, and then to share all of that.
Is this one of your favorites?
It actually is one of my favorites.
Yes. So do you want to go down that path a little bit? Yes, your favorites.
I also want to draw attention, I spoke at some point about the political Mir. There's a tremendous sense there, not only that he, coming from his relative position of privilege, is suffering, but he's also able to look at a larger society in meltdown across classes. And this was a society that, it's customary to see it as feudal in a certain limited way today. But there was a whole cycle of festivities and performances that held it all together across classes. And that's not a simple hegemony. And I think he came from that particular world, that affective community.
And I think that is why the loss of Delhi
Yeah.
was not just the loss of where he lived, but the loss of this entire larger community and what you just said, the community living and what they did. And that therefore even a place like Lucknow, because for us Delhi Lucknow एक जैसा है, वो बिल्कुल नहीं. जो दहलवी tradition है और वो जो लखनवी अवधी tradition है, वो you could very well be in Dakkan, and yeah. So I was planning to kind of wrap up with that, but you got there. So and I suppose that what makes it so relevant to us, not just Mir's work, but this book in particular, because I don't mean to be a salesperson, but I really, because especially in the last week or so, I read and I reread and I understood so much, not just about the poet, but about the times and about what you call the shattered city. That's what you call him.
Poet of the shattered city.
Poet of a shattered city. And in our own way, we feel that and we live that every day in well, it's the Mumbai Lit Fest, so we feel it, and therefore it's just absolutely brilliant how you have created the context and then celebrated the work by doing this wonderful translation.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, let me. हम भी इस शहर में शहर, and Sheher Ashub is the genre that he, among other poets, really transformed into something that we just still cherish today, the lament for the broken city. हम भी इस शहर में उन लोगों से है खाने खराब, मीर घर बार जिन्हों के राह सैलाब में है. I too am one of those people in this city whose homes have been trashed, Mir, whose everything lies in the flood's path. कर खौफ कलक खस्प की जो सुर्ख हैं आंखें, कर खौफ कलक खस्प की जो सुर्ख हैं आंखें, जलते हैं तरो खुश्क भी मिस्कीन के गज़ब में. Fear those who huddle around fires, their eyes red, both wet and dry will burn in the rage of the oppressed. Slightly more optimistic.
That's a good note to lead into the Q&A.
तारीख़ इश्क में है रहनुमा दिल, पैगंबर दिल है, क़िबला दिल, खुदा दिल. In the school of love, the heart's your guide. Prophet, heart, direction of prayer, heart, God, heart.
Yes. Anyone has anything to ask? If you read the book, you wouldn't, but it explains everything really well. Yes, the mic, please. And questions, not comments, that you can give him later on your own time.
Ranjit, thank you very much for the whole thing. How has Mir influenced poets of this century?
Oh. Wow. I've been so lost in the archaeology of Mir and looking at why the commentatorial tradition really, very early in the day, embalmed him in a couple of cliches and never looked back, that I haven't really thought about how he might have influenced. But that's a whole new subject. But I would like to think that some of these more radical elements in his work were not lost on possibly a number of the poets of the revolutionary age. Sometimes I caught myself thinking of Fairs as I was reading this. I don't, honestly, I'm just speculating here. I have no evidence for an actual genealogy there in poetry, but it struck me that a number of these verses could, resonate quite strongly with things that were written in the 20s and 30s. So I don't know, but this is certainly subject for research.
थैंक यू. अभी सबसे पहले मैं आप दोनों का बहुत शुक्रिया अदा करना चाहता हूँ कि आपने मीर के टॉपिक पर एक बुक भी आपने प्रकाशित की है और इस टॉपिक को इस सदी में लेकर आए हैं उस सदी से. इसके लिए आपका बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया. और मैडम कौसर मुनीर ने बहुत अच्छे से आपको जो क्वेश्चंस किए बहुत अच्छे किए. उसमें एक शेर आया था बीच में, सिरहाने मीर के, वो शेर को मैं ठीक से पढ़ रहा हूँ आपके सामने क्योंकि लास्ट मंथ हमने पुणे में मीर के ऊपर प्रोग्राम किया था. वी ऑल्सो रन सम पोइटिक ग्रुप देयर, मंजूमन के नाम से. सिरहाने मीर के कोई ना बोलो, वो शेर ऐसे है. सिरहाने मीर के कोई ना बोलो, अभी टुक रोते रोते सो गया है. तो टुक शब्द के ऊपर आप लोगों में जो चर्चा हो रही थी, मैं उस पर थोड़ा अपनी तरफ से कंट्रीब्यूशन करना चाहता हूँ कि टुक का मतलब वहाँ के स्थानीय लैंग्वेज में, मैं लखनऊ से हूँ, वहाँ की जो स्थानीय भाषा है उसमें टुक का मतलब यहाँ पर जो शेर में है उसका मतलब है कि ज़रा, अभी ज़रा रोते रोते सो गया है, कि अभी अभी सोया है. इसलिए सिरहाने मीर के कोई ना बोलो. और आयरनी ये है कि जहाँ लखनऊ में उनकी वफ़ात हुई और जिस जगह पर उनकी कब्र बनी, आज वहाँ पर रेलवे स्टेशन है चारबाग. तो एक तरफ तो ये शेर है, मतलब इस किस्से के साथ हमने महफिल को ख़त्म किया था कि एक तरफ तो हम कहते हैं कि सिरहाने मीर के कोई ना बोलो, और आज स्थिति यह है कि जहाँ उनकी कब्र थी वहीं पर वो चारबाग स्टेशन है और दिन में कम से कम वहाँ से सैकड़ों ट्रेन उसकी कब्र के ऊपर से गुजरती है. तो ये मीर के बारे में था. अच्छा, एक छोटी सी माफ़ी चाहूँगा आपसे, आप दोनों से. एक और, जब तक हम ये जिक्र ना करें, मीर के दो शेर छोटे छोटे हैं. नाजुकी उनके लब की क्या कहिए, आप सब ध्यान से सुनिए. नाजुकी उनके लब की क्या कहिए, एक मखोड़ी गुलाब की सी है. इससे ज़्यादा उम्दा शेर उर्दू शायरी में कहीं नहीं मिलेगा आपको. इतना सटल उसके अंदर जो इम्प्रेशन है, जो इसमें नज़ाकत है जो इस शेर में. और दूसरा उनका एक, बस वो शेर में कह के बात ख़त्म करूँगा, आपका ज़्यादा वक्त नहीं लूँगा. अल्लाह रे नाजुकी, अल्लाह रे नाजुकी, चमेली का फूल सर पर क्या रख दिया, कमर तक लचक गई. शुक्रिया बहुत बहुत.
We'll just take one more question because
Hello. Firstly, there was a debate between the languages where I'll just like to read a शेर. क्यों मुझको बनाते हो तासुब का निशाना. शायर इकबाल अशर कहते हैं, क्यों मुझको बनाते हो तासुब का निशाना, मैंने तो कभी खुद को मुसलमान नहीं माना. देखा था कभी मैंने भी खुशियों का ज़माना, अपने ही वतन में हूँ मगर आज अकेली, उर्दू है मेरा नाम मैं खुसरो की पहेली. So my question is to Ranjit sir, of course, while we are translating poetry, taking into consideration how difficult it is, but do you think translation is the only way that we are trying to keep the languages alive?
Thank you for the question and for the poem. Translation, I think, is one of the crucial ways in which we can keep language alive. But the fact that translation is at all possible, or that anyone's doing it, has to correspond to the vitality of those languages and their literatures. In this case, I have to say that, for instance, an institution like the Anjuman Taraqi Urdu-e-Hind in Delhi, now in Delhi, it's at this point it has people like Athar Farooqi and Salman Khurshid Saab at its head, and they have revitalized that institution. They want to make it connect to a larger multilingual and contemporary scenario. So it's vital that all of our languages should reassert this confidence, not in a jingoistic way, not to choose one language against others, but just to explore the richness of that language itself. But I think equally for all of us, we have to realize that the more we explore of our various languages here in South Asia, the more expansive our consciousness will be. And it just makes us, in the best sense, more liberal as individual sensibilities. So it's just...
I think that's the best way to end this session, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for allowing me to do this. Not an expert on either of the poets or the languages, so thank you.
And thank you all. Thank you, Kausar. Thank you all very much indeed.